obviously asymmetrical power relations continue to exist. That will continue to exist as long as there are nation states, but that doesn't mean that an empire will look any one way when you check back in with it across history, right? American empire today looks fundamentally different than American empire did in 1898 or in 1914 or in 1945.
Hello and welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm your host, Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places and the events that have shaped the USA into the country it is today. This week, as America's foreign relations once again dominate headlines, I want to explore just how powerful the country really is, and whether we should be understanding it as more than just a single nation. As I ask, is America an empire? And to discuss this, I'm joined by two very excellent guests. Firstly, from the faculty this week is Dr. Nicholas Grant, a historian of 20th century United States and author of Winning Our Freedoms Together, African Americans and Apartheid, 1945 to 1960. I'll pop a link to that book in the show notes as well. His research also focuses on race internationalism and transnational activism. Hello, Nick. Welcome back.
Hi, Liam. Thanks for having me back.
Great to have you on the podcast again. And our special guest today is Sarah Nelson, an assistant professor at the Netherlands Universiteit. I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, so I apologise, Sarah.
You can say Leiden University. It's what they use for their English language stuff.
Perfect.
If you want.
Thank you very much. And a historian of US empire, global governance, and decolonization. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for basically introducing yourself as well. I appreciate that. So when we talk about an empire, particularly when we think of America as an empire, this might kind of confuse our listeners. And it took me a little while to really understand myself how we were going to be covering this today. So I think for my benefit and our listeners' benefit, let's go kind of back to basics here. I guess, Sarah, I'll throw to you first. What are the key characteristics of an empire and how are we kind of understanding this?
Sure. So I think the conception of empire that we're most familiar with, and maybe the most uncontroversial definition, might be something like a political unit or organization made up of several different territories and peoples, almost universally acquired through various kinds of domination or conquest, whether military invasion or kind of economic colonization that builds. And then typically that political unit will have a center that will dominate over a subordinate periphery. And that periphery can be geographically proximate or it can be distant. But that definition isn't always fit for purpose, right? When describing empires in the past and in their various incarnations, right? Empires can be really messy with differing degrees of power and control. So we can often also call a relationship between two entities imperial just whenever there's a really stark power asymmetry between two parties, especially when one has a preponderance of military, political, or economic power and leverages that power in a kind of unilateral way over a less powerful other.
So if I'm understanding this right, because my really naive definition of an empire is like back in the days when the Brits and the Spanish and the Portuguese just went around taking ownership of land and calling it their own, and that was that. Do we have to think a bit more kind of geopolitical than that? Because from what you've said, it's an empire is not just about saying we're here now, yoink, this land is ours. It's that asymmetry in sort of power dynamics, which says to me that it's something a lot more kind of political.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a kind of material manifestation of empire in terms of dominion over peoples and places. And oftentimes we call that colonialism, right? When there's a kind of expansion of people or goods or markets. But also a key part of being an empire is performing imperially in geopolitical space. And so empires have to telegraph in various ways their imperialism to other imperial powers to consolidate their control, not just on the ground, but also in the international system. So there's obviously, absolutely, both a geopolitical dimension to it and then also a political economy to it that you can see working on the ground, for sure.
And Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on one of Sarah's earlier points about how traditional definitions of empire might not be fit for purpose, and you might be thinking about imperial arrangements within a nation state. So you've just got to think about the history of the Black freedom struggle and Black liberation in the United States and think about how various groups, I think probably most notably the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s, early 70s, thought about their position within American society as being colonized and being part of an internal colony in the quote-unquote American ghetto. So there you have a kind of system of they're critiquing American power overseas, most notably in Vietnam and elsewhere, and relating that experience directly to the experience of African Americans at home in a way that you might not traditionally think of as a form of imperial relationship domestically, but I think that kind of holds a lot of weight and was a really powerful tool for critiquing American power and advancing the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And I think just in general, I think we've got to think about empire as being really multifaceted. Again, as Sarah was saying, like it might be your kind of straight up annexation of a space or a territory, or it might be through a system of indirect rule, of economic and trading relationships that are maybe unequal. There might be a kind of system of settler colonialism in place where a territory is taken over by people who are not indigenous to that space. And I think a lot of those forms of power kind of fit in various parts of American history as well. So yeah, empire is very multifaceted, and you can see traces of all of that throughout the American past, really, and present potentially.
So are we saying, because America, as well as just being the 50 states, they have multiple territories as well, which, I mean, we could get stuck into how that all works, and I'd love to figure that out myself, because I know that they don't really have any control in who governs America, and yet America seems to have a lot of control over how these territories are governed themselves. But looking at places like Puerto Rico and Haiti, I believe, are they examples of how of this sort of American empire, or is it a bit? Is it less just kind of tangible and physical like that? Does it extend beyond just what America claims as its territories?
Yeah, so the United States to this day maintains control over a series of, we no longer call them colonies, but we now call them non self governing territories. And those include, like you said, Puerto Rico, but also American Samoa and Guam. And then historically, of course, that list also has to include the Philippines, Cuba, Hawaii, now a state. But I think it's worth mentioning that when it comes to US empire, historians have really debated over precisely what distinguishes American empire or what forces its inclusion in the category of empire. And so some historians call the US an empire because it conforms precisely to that formal definition that I started out with, as a political unit made up of non-contiguous territories, diverse peoples. But there are other historians who may not necessarily study the US's colonial empire that also still use that terminology because the United States still maintains asymmetrical relationships with almost every state it engages with, right? So historians like Victoria de Grazia, for example, have called the United States an irresistible empire. And she uses that to describe the US's outsized cultural or economic influence, especially in Europe, right? Thanks to mass-produced goods or forms of advertising. And then other historians have also called the US an archipelagic empire or a pointillist empire, oftentimes referring to the US's unprecedented and really unequaled expanse of global military bases all throughout the world, right? The US has almost 800 military bases worldwide, more than any other country in the world, spends more than $800 billion a year in its federal military budget. So on top of this, or actually maybe another way to organize these different ways of thinking about empire, lots of people like to distinguish between what they call soft empire and hard empire, and like to suggest that the United States is a soft empire because its power, especially in Europe, is so predominantly kind of commercial and cultural. And they distinguish that from a kind of hard British empire, for example, or Portuguese empire. But I think you can really only make that distinction with a straight face when you're thinking exclusively about the United States' relationship with Europe. And I think it's also really crucial to just remember that the United States' military empire has facilitated and always undergirded its commercial empire. So these distinctions between soft and hard empires are really, it's a really permeable boundary. And soft and hard empires often go hand in hand. And that's absolutely the case with the United States.
Mm. And you mentioned that, influence and military expansion as sort of two particular characteristics of an empire. And so when we think about sort of present day context here, to try and understand America on a sort of in a global context, could we also say that Russia is an empire by those same standards?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think so. I think I'm not an expert in Russian history and the current kind of foreign policy of Putin and others, but I think you can say, I think it's useful to take an imperial lens to understanding kind of a lot of questions in kind of thinking about geopolitics and historically as well. I think in terms of the United States, there's a lot of kind of, as Sarah was saying, kind of discussion about, okay, if America's an empire, what kind of an empire is it? Is it a soft empire? Is it a hard empire? You know, if it is an empire, how long is it an empire for? What are we comparing and contrasting it again? And I would just kind of come back to the sense, and a lot of historians have made this point from the American studies kind of background of Amy Kaplan, or from like US people interested in US foreign policy, some like Paul Kramer, that actually we can get kind of a bit hung up on this debate about saying, well, that's an empire and this isn't an empire. And actually like imperial ways of seeing and acting are the ways to be thinking about this. And then also there's kind of some useful, like really interesting scholarship over the last like 5 to 10 years about like trans-imperial relationships, how different empires reinforce one another as well. So I've massively sidestepped your question about Russia because I feel like underqualified to commentate on it. But I think just adopting a kind of imperial lens and thinking about these unequal relationships and these differential power relationships and hierarchies are just kind of fundamental to the way in which the world works and has always worked. And therefore, America shouldn't be an exception to that at all. Mm-hmm. And you just kind of have to look at various aspects of American history to see how entangled it is with the history of empire, even when it's not kind of directly exerting its imperial presence in a particular case or theatre.
Yeah, I think one of the core contributions of Paul Kramer, and I'm saying this not just because he was my graduate advisor, but that it's not necessarily that productive to pose the question, is something an empire? You know, to try to fit it into a formal definition when these formal definitions can often change over time depending on the politics that predominate in a certain moment, but rather is an entity behaving imperially? And that can be a more productive starting place to think about how a nation state or any kind of political entity is exerting power in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way of kind of reframing the whole point of this episode, in that, yeah, it's empire is clearly a far more fluid term than what I and many others probably expect. To sort of go on a little bit of a side sort of tangent, do we kind of negatively load our sort of understanding of countries like America when we apply the term empire? Is empire a bad word? And I ask that also thinking, should it be a bad word? Is it a bad thing? Does it have to be a bad thing?
Well, I think like people like Niall Ferguson, the historian, would have said no, not necessarily, right? But I think that's such a hard and difficult point to kind of maintain because there's so much historical and contemporary evidence to suggest that empire can never be a good thing because it's based on unequal power relations and asymmetries of power, as Sarah said earlier. And I think, and there are very clear reasons why America doesn't like to be talked about as an imperial power as well, because it kind of runs contrary to its sense of self, its founding values, the ideas of democracy. What I find really interesting is the way in which activists and anti-colonial intellectuals, whether they're operating from within the United States or elsewhere in the world, critique American power through the lens of thinking about it and naming it as an empire as well. So there's tons of examples of this. I've got kind of a couple that I might come on to, but I was thinking before, because you mentioned Haiti, Liam, when the US invades Haiti, I'm going to get the date wrong, 1915, maybe question that in the edit. In the early 20th century, you've got Hubert Harrison, who is from the Caribbean originally, and he's migrated to the United States. He's living in Harlem. He's a journalist. He works for the post office and things as well, but he's a journalist and works for Marcus Garvey's a Negro World publication, a black nationalist publication, but he's a black socialist essentially. And he writes a series of pieces about America's invasion of Haiti. And America goes into Haiti and takes Haiti's financial reserves and kind of administers them through Wall Street. It's about maintaining the sphere of influence in the Caribbean and kind of proximity to the Panama Canal and things like that, and kind of thinking about trade routes and stuff like that. It's straight up in imperialism. But what Harrison does in his writing is that he says America's actions overseas are making a mock of democracy. He kind of trots out that line repeatedly and makes other kind of analogies and kind of says, I expect better from the United States when it says it's not an imperial power, it's behaving in a way that an empire would. And he writes these pieces that gain a lot of traction, and a lot of African Americans in particular write kind of petitions and lobby and protest against America's invasion of Haiti and make very clear connections between the system of Jim Crow segregation and how American Marines are behaving in Haiti, which is, the first independent black state to overthrow slavery in the late 18th century. So I'm kind of getting bogged down into the weeds a little bit with that particular example, but I think it's really important because, of course, like empire is a bad word and it can never be something that is justifiable. But when you have a nation that is kind of saying, well, we're actually out of this anti-imperial tradition, we overthrew the British Empire, we're about freedom and democracy and spreading those values around the world, so how can we be an empire? Looking at the people who are at the blunt end of American power and how they chose to name America as an empire and to call out its imperial practices, I think is really valid. And I think we should listen to those people and those histories in particular when we think whether empire is ever a good or a bad thing. So yeah, sorry, that's a long way of answering that question, but I really like you, Harrison.
And actually, on that point, I want to look at this sort of transition that America or the US has gone on, because we need to acknowledge the fact that the US itself was the target of imperialism. Native Americans very much the victims of imperialism when the French, the Spanish, and the English came over and claimed what became the states as their own land. So, at what point did the US stop being the colonized and start being the colonizer?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting historical question that is still up to interpretation among historians of North America. So I think the sort of classic, maybe go-to date is often August or December 1898 with the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, right? So that's when the United States won their war against the Spanish Empire and as a result acquired Spain's former colonies, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. But there's a good case to be made to date the transition from colony to empire far earlier, basically to include American colonists' gradual expansion south and westward, outward from the 13 colonies. So I think you could also very reasonably include events like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, right? And the Trail of Tears, which is the forced displacement and ethnic cleansing of 60,000 Native Americans, the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. Obviously, there had been mass murder and mass displacement of Native Americans before this, but the Trail of Tears was really the first mass displacement coordinated centrally by the US federal government. So we can kind of think of that as a formal policy of internal colonization and internment, which is really a hallmark of colonial empire. But other reasonable origin points could also be like the Mexican-American War, right? In 1848, when the US invaded what was then Mexico and annexed the Republic of Texas. And again, that's kind of an apotheosis of waves of planned settler colonial expansion across native land. So building organically, right, on patterns of expansion displacement. So I think this question of when US empire began can actually be kind of a moving target. And I think putting too specific or narrow a date on it can sometimes obscure actually what an accumulative process it was, right? The ambition to an extraterritorial or overseas empire was long preceded by the colonization of the American continent. So there's this real longstanding playbook and set of political, ideological, cultural, economic precedents at work long before 1898.
Yeah, and I don't want to be kind of victim blaming or anything here. So I don't want this to be taken like that. But is there an element of Americans just kind of grew up doing what worked for their ancestors and the generations that came before them, right? They learn how to build a successful nation off the back of their grandparents and their grandparents who were imperialists, and then ultimately they became slave owners. And then in more modern times, I mean, call it what you want, but there are still these power dynamics that you spoke of, that, okay, nothing akin to slavery or outright sort of mass murder that happens, hundreds of years ago. But the ideology is still very much the same, is it not?
I think, do you mean in terms of the ideology, in terms of like America, despite rebelling against and overturning British imperial rule, still kind of having that as part of their culture? Is that the kind of the point?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think there's a lot to that in a way, right? I think part of this idea that America isn't an empire, we can't call America an empire, as I said earlier, is that America is, about the American Revolution. It's about ridding the states of this oppressive British colonizer, right? And then the assumption after that is that there is, kind of an internal nation building process within the United States where America and Britain kind of take different paths because of the American Revolutionary War, etc. But actually, like, there's a lot of connections still, right? A lot of people, not everyone in the United States, saw kind of Britain as a natural ally. A lot of British people saw America, even though it was kind of post-colonial in lots of ways, as, a kind of ally. It was before the special relationship, but a kind of precursor to that. And I just kind of always remember this statistic, right, as well, that you think about in the mid-19th century, prior to this American Civil War, around about 80% of the cotton that was processed in British mills in Lancashire was directly imported from cotton picked in the American South by enslaved African Americans. And then the finances, the money, the profit, the taxation derived from that industry obviously went into expanding forms of the British imperial project elsewhere in the world as well. So even though you have this break and you have these differences, you have like the kind of, I guess, the imperial relationship between the American state and African Americans in the context of slavery, funding forms of British empire and imperialism as well. So it is part of this, as Sarah was saying, this cumulative process. And even though there is this kind of direct break between America and European forms of empire, there are so many connections, both in terms of finance and trade and social connections, that keep America within that imperial orbit, and behaving, I think, in ways that you would talk about an empire as behaving, if that makes sense.
I also think that kind of, I'm hearing in that question a kind of imperial inevitability, right? Like, weren't Americans always destined to be imperial? For it is all they inherited and all that they knew. I think that fails to really incorporate the fact that so many of the people who ended up settling in the United States were themselves political refugees, who themselves were pacifists or abolitionists or Quakers, right? The expansion of the American colonists across the West was not inevitable or a foregone conclusion. It was highly contested, just like slavery, highly contested at the time. And so I think to say this was always going to happen, this is just something in the American imagination, it actually kind of participates in that Frederick Jackson Turner, to the sea thesis of it is in the genus of the American, whatever, character to expand and to dominate. And that's just simply not true, I don't think. I don't think we can actually make that argument at all. And it covers over this really rich history of opposition to expansion and exploitation, especially of non-white people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term you used, was it imperialist inevitability, is a nice one. I'm going to steal that.
Also,
yeah.
imperial, it wasn't inevitable in part. There were also racist reasons for not becoming an empire, right? There were a lot of, racist people in the United States in the 19th century that said we shouldn't acquire non-contiguous territories because non-white peoples would dilute the democracy-loving nature that is inherent to white people. Non-white people are not capable of self-governing, therefore they cannot become part of our nation because they won't, they will undermine the things that are intrinsic to us and that we hold so dear. So lots of fronts on which empire was not inevitable for the United States.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I wanted to ask this question is because on a previous episode I was talking to Andy Borden about Native American colonies in the South after the Civil War, and how there was still this sort of like mirroring of like white societal sort of hierarchies, and part of that, even before the Civil War, involved almost this sort of mimicry of like slavery. Native American cultures would sort of adopt these similar sort of ways of governance, and what struck me about that was that it wasn't about that they believed in that system. It was a matter of survival. They were appropriating the cultures and the traditions of the governing race, I guess, in order to just survive in a nation that they were stuck in. And I wonder if there's an element of that in sort of what we're talking about now. And I'm taking silence as probably no, but I wanted to ask the question.
Well, I think inevitably when white supremacy is undergirded by violence, an element of compulsion that will happen, and that, yeah, in the face of obliteration, adaptation is required. I don't know if I would go so far as to say, I think what you were saying was that Native Americans sometimes participated in slavery in order to survive in a white colonist world. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, violence violence begets adaptation, but I don't know if I'm comfortable with that characterization. Yeah.
But more on that, and it's a while since I've read or taught this, but there was a great book a few years ago by an Afro-Indigenous scholar called Kyle T. Mays, called An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, who kind of like takes that on and kind of draws on the work of people like Tia Miles and others who are thinking about, that kind of question about within this system of settler colonialism and imperialism, how do kind of African Americans and Native Americans survive, and how does that kind of transform and make those relationships difficult. And they critique the kind of idea that, like they said, a common kind of response to whenever people talk about Native American history within the kind of Black study circles, like historically, was, but they enslaved African Americans as well. And they have very strong kind of counter arguments to that, and talk about the kind of need for the point of connection and of shared ideas of resistance as well. I'm not really doing justice to their arguments here, but I'd recommend those two historians in particular. And I'm always kind of like thinking about someone like Stokely Carmichael in the Black Power movement, who is kind of talking a lot about kind of Indigenous and African American solidarity at times as well, and the need for that. Mm-hmm. And says when some, African Americans kind of joined up to fight in the Civil War to kind of try and defeat slavery in the South, in the American Revolutionary War, to try and resist the British colonizers, that they should have kind of put their lot in with the British and the Native Americans and tried to get America out of there as well. So there are these kind of points of connection. And I think those historians look at the way in which these kind of unequal power relations and the system of settler colonialism combined with Jim Crow to kind of create divisions between these groups. And they're arguing about points of connection and the need to kind of overcome those divisions as well. But I would defer to those scholars, and I'll make sure I'll send you over those links, Liam, that you can put in the description.
Yeah, and they will be in the show notes for sure. And I think really the crux of my questioning is around the fact that we've agreed that America is an empire. We've agreed that an empire is pretty unanimously bad, and yet the empires and imperialism continues to perpetuate through time. If everyone agreed unanimously that this shouldn't happen, that it was a bad thing, why does it continue to happen? Why do these structures of governance continue to exist? And that's, I think, fundamentally what's confusing me here.
Why these imperial power structures continue to exist. I think like at their root, it's about profit and money, and it's about exerting control. And I think it's, when you think about like the kind of need to decolonize, or that language of decolonization, which we see in particular at the moment, I think it's based on the refusal to kind of acknowledge imperial histories and colonial pasts. And the US is particularly guilty of that, as is Britain, as is a lot of other spaces as well. So you kind of see that in the backlash to like the global Black Lives Matter movement that kind of re-emerged in 2020 during the pandemic. And then that kind of denialism of like, we don't need to kind of consider these issues, and that kind of language of woke, people getting upset about nothing, to kind of diminish those claims and to diminish those histories. So I think it's a system that works for a lot of people, that is, well, not actually a lot of people, works for people who are quite powerful and want to maintain kind of political and economic power, and also is a kind of mass refusal to grapple with and properly consider the histories of empire and imperialism, and how places like America and Britain and elsewhere might be interconnected in terms of those histories as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing in this question of like, how do empires endure? And I actually think it's because they adapt and change. Obviously, asymmetrical power relations continue to exist. That will continue to exist as long as there are nation states, but that doesn't mean that an empire will look any one way when you check back in with it across history, right? American empire today looks fundamentally different than American empire did in 1898 or in 1914 or in 1945, right? You can actually really see turning points in the way that the United States has exercised its power abroad over the course of the 20th century that are helpful and instructive for understanding how the United States has grown and then maintained its power from what was once a settlement of 13 colonies and then eventually a kind of regional power and then a unipolar power in the world. In the US case, I think without making an exceptionalist argument for American empire, I think one thing that makes American power exceptional in the 20th century is in part the ways that the United States was able to embed its hegemony at the levels of global governance itself. It's like the fingerprint of the United States is all over the institutions that now structure or came to structure the world order as it was built after World War II, starting in 1945. So with the UN system, with the creation of the Bretton Woods economic arrangements, et cetera, on and on, the United States has been able to kind of embed and metastasize its power in this variety of organizations that now govern most of the ways that lots of people live their lives, on the economic front, on the political front, and also on the cultural front, right? The United States, like globalization, we often use as kind of synonymous with Americanization or the globalization of American culture, which is problematic in its own way, but I'll bracket that. But that is to say, empires endure because they adapt and change. Asymmetrical power relationships will exist forever because of the ways that nation states consolidate political and economic power, in state structures and in class structures.
That's making me, sorry if I can jump in, that's making me think about something I use in teaching quite a lot, which is a piece that Nelson Mandela wrote in 1958 called A New Menace in Africa, like this point about how empires change and adapt, and how embedded America is in kind of these global systems of control by the mid-20th century. And he kind of argues in that piece that America is a new menace in Africa that threatens to destroy the newly gained independence of many kind of Asian and African states, and to kind of be a kind of counter-revolutionary force working against decolonization. And he kind of argues in that piece that American imperialism comes to Africa, I think he calls it elaborately disguised. And he says like the American brand of imperialism is kind of it's basically the same as European empire and colonialism, but it's dressed in, I think he called modern clothing, and it's then officials talk in a sweet language spoken in ways to try and appeal to people. But fundamentally, he's kind of warning people in Southern Africa, for example, to kind of be wary of the United States and its kind of systems of control and power, and how it is trying to make inroads into the sub-Saharan continent in order to maintain its strategic military and economic agenda, and in the context of the Cold War. And, like Mandela at this point is kind of leaning towards the Soviets and the Communist Party, so there's kind of an element of that. But the context is that in South Africa at this time, just as the civil rights movement is kind of really getting rolling in America, you have the American government investing in the apartheid state because it's a key strategic military site for it in order to try and stop the spread of communism. There's military bases in South Africa. It has a large supply of uranium for the nuclear arms race, and it's a place where raw materials are abundant and American businesses can kind of do well. So the idea is that that is kind of the priority, despite a kind of white supremacist, white settler government, because they're vehemently anti-communist and are supportive of America's role in the world. Those kind of issues on kind of addressed in America is kind of behaving in this imperial way and maybe taking up the mantle of more kind of formal European empires that are on the run by this point because of mass anti-colonial movements around the world.
So thank you both for that explanation. That was incredibly helpful, and I think I know what the very short answer to this next question is going to be. But just to sort of round off this discussion, is there any way at all that people could reasonably argue that America is not an empire?
I have a long answer. Well, I have a long answer and a short answer. And the short answer is no. The long answer is, so even if you want to bracket the United States unipolar power and world order, right, and not count that as a species of empire, and also even if you want to bracket all the ways that the U.S. has operated as a quasi-empire in Southeast Asia or in Latin America, there's just not a reasonable way to argue that the U.S. has never been an empire. It's like arguing that George Washington was never a president. It's just a point of historical fact that the United States pursued, acquired, and ruled over a vast colonial empire, and that the United States continues to rule over colonies, again, now euphemized as territories, over Puerto Rico, Samoa, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands. Right. And of course, the U.S. also continues to occupy unceded Native American land, and Native American tribes continue to live on reservations contained in and subordinate to state and federal governments, even though we call them sovereign. So I think the only thing to really talk about is actually the political and the historical reasons that lead people to deny the fact of American empire, right? Like, why are they doing it and to what end? I think what we shouldn't underestimate here is the durability of American exceptionalism and the racism that lays at the bedrock of that. So American imperialists, like all imperialists, right, often justify the imperial project as one of civilizing, right? That it participates in a civilizing mission to bring either faith or democracy or modernity or order to uncivilized people. And in the US, I think this could be particularly potent because it was mixed with this self-conception of coloniality, right? That the United States, if it was an empire, it was an empire of liberty. And this kind of civilizing narrative actually only grew more powerful over the course of the 20th century as it wore on, especially with the Cold War, right? When the US really wanted to disavow itself as an empire or even its connection with empires, right? The Soviet Union often critiqued the US as a leader of an imperial capitalist world order. So there was a real geopolitical incentive for Americans and the American political class to dig deep into empire denial. And then again, this intensified all the more with the wave of decolonization from the 1950s to the 1970s, when the US wanted to court the loyalty of decolonizing states and prevent a kind of global communist revolution in the decolonizing world. Such that by the 1960s and 70s, and this is getting into Nick's expertise here, calling the US an empire really became identified with a leftist politics, especially with organizations like the Black Panthers or the New Left, which I think gave some permission, right, to liberals or centrists and conservatives alike to dismiss the language of empire as radical and really unserious, which I think has carried forward to some extent today. And so I think these are all the kind of historical and political reasons that help Americans think of their own power in the world as virtuous, right? So alchemizing empire into virtue rather than calling it what it is, which is asymmetrical power relationships that lead to poverty and inequality that affect human well-being.
Nick,
that's my long answer.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think that I certainly couldn't put that better. I think that's such a great way of kind of characterizing that, and there's so much packed into that answer. But yeah, I think that's the crux of it, right? Like, is that there are reasons why, that America does not want to see itself or admit that it's an empire. And again, I just go back to that kind of point that, and I mean, I guess I would say this as a historian, to kind of look at how people have critiqued empire, American empire, I guess in particular in the context of this podcast, and how they've tried to resist it, and how they've named those processes as well. and how they've analysed them. And you could go back to the founding of the United States to kind of find examples of that, from Indigenous histories, from African American histories, from the histories of other groups as well. And I think listening to those voices is really important. It's a little bit of a generalized statement, but and that point about discrediting, the kind of imperial critique of America that Sarah was making because it was bound up with kind of leftist politics, I think that is really powerful, and the power of kind of anti-radicalism and anti-communism obscures people from taking the histories of anti-colonial activists seriously, I think. And I think if we don't do that in this contemporary moment, then we kind of lose a language for critiquing forms of empire and imperialism in our current moment.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. And on that note, I think that just about wraps up this episode. So thank you so much to my guests this week, Nicholas Grant and Sarah Nelson. And also thank you for your eloquence and your patience throughout this episode. If you want to find out more, we've left some useful links in the show notes for you, so do check out those. But if anyone wants to connect with you two, where can they do that, Nick?
Oh, I'm still just about on Twitter or X, Nicholas G Grant. So I'm there at the moment.
And Sarah?
I'm at Sarah Says _etc.
Wonderful. And you can find me on X via This Is the Hef, and on LinkedIn as well. Just search for Liam Heffernan. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and review wherever you're listening to this, and give us a follow as well, so all future episodes appear in your feed. Thank you very much. Goodbye.